Hey guys, welcome back to another segment of ACE Insider. For those of you that have anatomy questions or anatomy has been scaring you, this episode is specifically for you. We've got a special guest here, Captain Bones.
I'm also here too, guys. David, how's it going?
And we've got Pete McCall. I'm totally kidding. He's actually a real special guest. ACE certified personal trainer and fitness educator. You might have seen him or seen his name all around fitness circuits, and he's been speaking at different conferences as well.
That's right, and a lot of you guys, we've been asking you what kind of content you want to see, and a lot of you said topics on anatomy. More specifically, the shoulders, hip joints, and SI joint.
And for those of you studying or currently working with clients, this is a great deep dive into the planes of motion as well.
Oh, wait, I got to talk about anatomy. That's not what you told me I'm doing. You said I'm going to play pirate ship. Okay, no, of course.
That's later.
No, so guys, thank you for bringing me in because I can totally relate to this when learning anatomy. And one thing that I really recommend is if you want to know anatomy, and if you understand anatomy, understand how everything links, that gives you a lot of options for designing exercise programs. Here's what I did when I was learning anatomy, and I kid you not. I bought an anatomy coloring book. I actually bought 2 anatomy coloring books. You go on your favorite search engine for a bookstore, online bookstore, something rhymes with Glamazon, and you go type a search engine for, anatomy coloring book and buy one. Because when you color, you can see where all the muscles are, and that really does help you take ownership of the material. So we are going to talk today about the shoulder. First of all, the shoulder has 4 specific joints in it, and you can kind of follow along on your own body. So this is your clavicle, your collarbone. There's not going to be a test on this, we're just kind of reviewing this. So if you find your collarbone and go in here to your chest or your sternum, so clavicle and sternum, that's your sternoclavicular joint, your SC joint. So if you put your finger right here where you can find that, you go up and down, you can feel that's about the only motion the SC joint allows. Other than that, it's relatively stable. Now follow your clavicle out. So you're going to follow the clavicle out here and find this little notch here on the end of your shoulder blade. Now technically the shoulder blade is a scapula. I'm going to go back and forth with both terms because I want you to get the concept more than actually naming the bones. Naming the bones isn't as important. That's why we got the captain here. But what is important is you understand how they work together for movement. So this is your clavicle. This is the acromion process of your scapula. You can find that right here on your shoulder. The acromion process in the clavicle, that's your acromio, your AC, acromioclavicular joint. So acromioclavicular joint. Oftentimes if somebody has a shoulder separation, it's a separation here at that ligament. If you put this bone, if you go up and down, you can feel how that moves. That happens a lot in contact sports. So you have sternoclavicular, SC, acromioclavicular, AC. This is your scapula. The cup, this is a ball and socket joint. The socket is the glenoid fossa. The glenoid fossa is the cup of the shoulder blade, of the scapula. The head of the humerus creates the ball. Now, we've learned our planes of motion. And if you haven't, that's why we have a phone. We can always look it up. But we have 3 planes of motion. We have sagittal, which you go front and back. Everything flexes or extends. We have lateral and frontal plane. This is our frontal plane or coronal plane. And everything either laterally flexes or we side bend laterally flex, laterally extend. We can also AB, move away, or AD, duct, add towards the body, AB, abduct, take away from the body. Easy ways to remember it. And the way I remembered it, we're talking kind of about spooky Halloween. When I was learning this stuff, I'm serious, you get abducted by aliens. Aliens take you away, so abduction is moving away from the body. Whatever works for you. It was a time of the X-Files, so that's where we were. So this is your GH, your glenohumeral joint. You have the glenoid fossa and the head of the humerus. So 1, 2, 3 joints. The 4th joint is how the scapula itself sits on the rib cage. Now keep in mind, the only place the scapula has a bony attachment to the body is right here at the SC joint. The only place the scapula attaches is here, the SC joint. Other than that, and this is for Trivial Pursuit people, your scapula floats on 17 different muscles. So if you have tightness in the scapula, if you have like an altered length tension relationship, tight on one side, long or lengthened on the other, it can change the position of the scapula, which changes the motion of the shoulder. Now, one thing that's very important to remember, realize, is that the 4th plane of motion is we have the sagittal, we have the frontal, we have the transverse. I started going there and got off track, I'm sorry. The 4th plane of motion is how the cup of the glenoid fossa sits off the shoulder blade. So that's not in the frontal plane, it's not in the sagittal plane, but it's in a different plane. Try this at home. Take your arm out to the side like we normally do shoulder presses, overhead presses. You can feel an impingement. Put your fingers here. That impinges, meaning that pinches. So if Captain Bones here is doing an overhead press, If the scapula doesn't move with them, what happens here? The head of the humerus is running into the acromion process. But if you move your arm to the front, so if you move your arm to the front of the body, what's going to happen is you're going to align the head of the humerus with the cup of the glenoid fossa. So when it goes up, now the scapula can rotate. Those 17 muscles will help rotate the scapula to support the shoulder. So try this. Take the arm overhead. That doesn't feel too good. Take your arm overhead here. Now if you're doing an overhead press at the top, you want to kind of pull your shoulder down to set the shoulder, and then pull your arm down. So you push up and pull down. If your clients have any type of shoulder impingement, I highly recommend that's where they're doing an overhead press. Now, if you have clients that are pretty kyphosis, your spine has a few different curves. The lordotic curve is a curve to the front. We have that here in the cervical spine. The kyphotic curve is a curve to the back, the posterior. That's here in the thoracic spine. If you have excessive curvature, if a client has excessive curvature of the spine, we call that kyphosis, excessive curvature. When that happens, the shoulder blade rotates forward a little bit, and this arm can't really move with the shoulder blade. The humerus doesn't, the scapulohumeral rhythm, that sounds fancy, but just really the humerus doesn't move well with the scapula. So what we can do to set that is when our clients come in to see us, especially in the evening, if they've been at work all day, is have them lie on the ground. Because if you lie on the ground, if Captain Bones is on the ground, we take the spine out of gravity, the spine lays against the ground, and you can stretch out the front of the shoulders by pushing the shoulder blades back. So you're looking at this red thing. What I want to do is show you some of the muscles here at the shoulder which can be impacted. First of all is your rotator cuff muscle. Sorry, it's 4 muscles, rotator cuff muscles. It's a whole little segment here set. So when you look at the rotator cuff, to break it down, this is the spine of the scapula. Superior is above, inferior is below. So if we see the supraspinatus is superior to the spine of the scapula. So if I put my muscle through right here, that's the supraspinatus. That's when the muscles that gets impinged. If you do those shoulder presses out to the side, that's going to impinge the supraspinatus. Underneath the spine of the scapula, inferior, is the infraspinatus. Those are your SI. Rotator cuff is 4 muscles. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, which sits here. These 3 muscles are external rotators, meaning they externally rotate the humerus. So if you know your rotator cuff, it's SITS. Supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and then the subscapularis. Now, Captain Bones here doesn't have an articulating shoulder, but imagine if the red band here, that's the subscapularis. It attaches below the scapula, to the humerus. So we have those 4 muscle attachments which guide the head of the humerus around. And that's why doing the overhead press, give me your shoulder here. If I do the overhead press, here, those muscles, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, pull that humeral head down into the cup of the shoulder blade. So if you do an overhead press, push that arm up in the front of the body, and at the top, keep the shoulder stable. You can have people practice that by doing that on the ground. If I were working with Captain Bones, especially after work, I would just have him lay on the ground, overhead, push his thumbs into the ground. Hold that for about 15 to 30 seconds, and you're basically resetting the shoulder blade. You'll notice that if he stands up, he'll be in a taller posture because we're resetting. Now, another thing to know about the shoulder is we have the pec major, the pec minor, and the lat dorsi. So your pec major, our chest muscle, attaches from the sternum here to the humerus. Now, if that gets tight, it's going to create internal rotation of the head of the humerus. It's going to pull the humerus in towards the midline of the body. It's also, if the humerus rotates in, it pulls the scapula forward. Now, a lot of times we think the chest and the back work opposite of each other, which they kind of do, but in the transverse plane, the pec, because of its attachment here at the bicipital groove, internally rotates the humerus. Now the lat dorsi, I'm going to move Captain Bones around here. The lats are a large muscle which attach down here to the low back. They also attach at the bicipital groove of the humerus. So guess what happens? The lat and the chest and the pec are co-contractors, meaning they work together. They both create internal rotation of the shoulder. So that's why for people that are protracted forward, we got to be careful about doing too many pressing and pulling exercises that only isolate the pec or the lat. Because if I'm working my lat, I'm creating more internal rotation here at the head of the humerus. If we do a lot of chest exercises, we create more internal rotation. That's why push-ups, in all honesty, push-ups, hands on the ground, keeping your spine stable, are one of the best exercises you can do for both the chest and the shoulders. Because if you lay on a bench, and this happens a lot with people, especially you get a little bit more mature. I'm in my mid-40s. That's my chronological age. How I act is a lot different, but at least I'm a little bit older. But what happens when you start getting older, you start doing a lot of like bench exercises, is the bench is here. If you have a bench here, that hits the scapula and it restricts range of motion of the scapula. If people are sitting all day at the office, probably shouldn't have them use a bench for presses. It's much better, it's much healthier, I should say, much healthier for the shoulder to have them do push-ups. Or the other thing, standing cable presses. Either push-ups, hands on the ground, or a standing cable press. Because when you do that, if I have Captain Bones press here, if I have Captain Bones press, a standing cable press, we get much more freedom of motion of that shoulder here. All four of those joints are moving. These 17 muscles which control the scapula have more freedom of motion. But if I'm laying back on a bench, if a client's laying back on a bench, the bench restricts the motion of the scapula. That can lead to a number of different issues. Now, keep in mind, the shoulders attached to the hips. So a lot of people have hip questions. And this stuff, honestly, take the time to do the coloring book. I mean that sincerely. If you start coloring the muscles different colors, and you see where they attach, and you see how they function, you start seeing the lines of force, and you start seeing how they work. Like I said, I went through 2 coloring books when I was learning this stuff, and this didn't happen overnight. So we have our shoulders sit on top of our hips. Our shoulders attached to our hips via our spine. The lat dorsi comes down here and attaches to what we call the thoracolumbar fascia. That's all that muscle tissue right here. Basically, the way to think about this is all a bunch of Velcro right here. So these muscles in the upper back muscle attaches down there. If that upper back muscle becomes too tight, then look at what it's going to do. It's going to pull that pelvis. It's going to create an upward force on that pelvis, and that can create an anterior rotation of the pelvis. So if I'm going to stand up and demonstrate, because I'm more mobile than Captain Bones here, if I rotate my pelvis forward, that's an anterior tilt of the pelvis. That can come from a couple different things. One, from the lats. And if people spend a lot of time at a desk, the lats will rotate the shoulder in and pull up on the back of the pelvis, pull up here, and create that anterior rotation. So if you stand up and you raise your arm overhead, you can also feel a little tug. The other thing I do is, you notice how the lab jacket I'm wearing, if I take my arm overhead, you see those lines? Those lines match up pretty perfectly with the way that what the muscle does. You can show that to your clients in the mirror of the gym and say, hey, this is the muscle that you're using. So we have the lat that comes down here and attaches at the pelvis. Not the pelvis, but attaches at the thoracolumbar fascia. Now to the front, here, now we're getting away from the shoulder joint, but that's how the shoulder connects to the hip. Now at the front, we have something called, this is your psoas muscle. The psoas muscle goes from the middle of the spine, from the lateral edge of the spine, to the inside edge, the medial edge of the pelvis. That's the psoas. You have the iliacus muscle comes here from the iliac crest, and that comes down to the lesser trochanter. This is a greater trochanter, this is a lesser trochanter. So when you're here, actually greater trochanter, lesser trochanter. When you're here, that muscle attaches down, your hip flexors pull the hip up into flexion. Your hip flexors pull that hip up. The iliacus and the psoas muscle kind of bleed in together, and if they get tight, and imagine you're sitting at a desk all day, where's that muscle being held? That muscle is being held in a shortened position. So now, if that muscle is held in a short position, what muscle is on the opposite side of it being held in a lengthened position? Why? That would be your your glute maximus. That's your gluteus maximus. So when you look at that, the gluteus maximus comes down here from the pelvis. It blends in all the way down to the outside of the femur. So the glute primarily does hip extension. The glute will extend the hip. The other two things the glute will do is abduct the femur, and it externally rotates the femur. Wait, what was that? Our psoas muscle, our iliacus and psoas muscle, they create hip external rotation. They create hip flexion and hip external rotation. The glute creates hip extension, so they work opposite each other in the sagittal plane, but the glute also creates hip external rotation. Here's the thing. You have about 9 different muscles which create hip external rotation. You only have one muscle that creates a little bit of force for an internal rotation moment, or an internal rotation torque. That's your little TFL, your tensor fasciae latae, right here at the front. Why? Because when you step, when your leg is in front of the body, like when you walk, your hip internally rotates. When you step and your foot hits the ground, your hip internally rotates. That's why you have all these muscles back here designed to decelerate to control internal rotation. Now, if these muscles get out of balance, that happens from staying seated all day. If the front of the body, the front gets tight, if the iliacus and psoas gets tight from being seated, and Captain's Bones' lower leg isn't working with me, but if these muscles get tight and I'm trying to extend that hip, it's going to pull on that spine. And it's also the tightness here is going to shut down, create what we call reciprocal inhibition. It's going to shut down. Tightness on one side creates weakness or length in the other side of the muscle. So that's why when we look at a lot of our programs, when we look at a lot of the stuff that we have on the website, two of the primary exercises we can do with clients, especially in the stability mobility phase of the IFT model, is by doing hip extension, by laying on the ground and doing a hip press or a glute bridge, however you call that. By doing a glute bridge, what we're having clients do is we're having clients strengthen the glutes. But at the same time, as the glutes contract, they are lengthening, they are causing the hip flexors to lengthen. So a glute bridge is not only a good glute exercise to strengthen the glutes and whatever else may happen like tone, it's just an added benefit, but what you're also doing is creating a dynamic stretch of the hip flexor. So if you have people that are seated all day and they come into the gym, a glute bridge is a great exercise to do. The other exercise is a high plank. The high plank with the hands on the ground, you have to create stability here at the shoulder girdle, you have to create stability through the spine, and the high plank you have to extend the hips. So if you're doing a good plank, like a good yoga plank, you're pushing your hands into the ground, you're pushing your back up into your shoulders, and you're squeezing the quads and the glutes. Do you know what I don't tell people to do when they do a plank? I don't tell them to squeeze here, because that doesn't matter. If you push the hands into the ground, you activate the shoulders. That creates spinal stability. By squeezing the glutes and squeezing the quads, you create stability at the hip, and you get these muscles will turn on automatically as a response. There's a reflexive condition in there. So when we look at the hips, it's not really that complicated. What happens is, if they get tight and that hip is held in this position, what we have to do is we have to strengthen the glutes. And we also have to put it through a range of motion. Now here's a little trick, and I'll have you try this in a second. A lot of people complain of what? Tight hamstrings. The hamstrings attached down here at the bottom of the pelvis at the ischial tuberosity. The biceps femoris comes on the outside of the femur. The membranosus and tendinosus come down on the inside. But what the hamstrings do is the hamstrings aren't necessarily tight, but look at their attachment point on the pelvis. If that pelvis is rotated to the anterior, that's going to lengthen the hamstrings so they feel tight. I'll say that again. If the front of your pelvis is tight, if your hip flexors are here, creating an anterior tilt to the pelvis, you can see what I'm doing with my hips here. If these muscles are tight, the hip flexor muscles create an anterior rotation, that lengthens the hamstring muscles, which make them feel tight. If you want to reduce tension in your hamstrings, try this. Stand up, wherever you are. If you're at a coffee shop, if you're at the gym, stand up. Reach down and touch your toes. I want you to feel the tightness. Now what I want you to do is take your right leg back a little bit. Right leg back, keep the heel on the ground, lean back a little, and stretch the arm overhead. Do you feel that stretch right here? That's your hip flexor. What you're doing is you're lengthening that. So when you lengthen the hip flexor, you keep holding that. When you lengthen the hip flexor, you're reducing tension, and you're allowing the hip to have more range of motion. What you're also doing is resetting the pelvis relative to the spine. So hold that, lean back a little bit further, squeeze your glute. So if you have your right arm up and this is your right hip, squeeze your right glute, and relax. Now switch, let's do the other side. So rotate this in just a little bit, because remember, it's an external rotator. So if you want to get a little stretch, you got to create a little internal rotation, squeeze the glute, lean back a little bit, take that arm overhead, squeeze, squeeze, squeeze the glute, your glute, not your neighbor's, not the person next to you at the gym. They get a little upset with that, trust me. And keep that stretch up, hold. Now kind of rotate back a little bit, because you're trying to create length in it right now. Now, we just did two little stretches, right? Reach down, touch your toes again. Pretty cool, huh? You get a little bit more freedom of motion. So the tight psoas, the tight iliacus, create the anterior tilt. That creates the tension here where people feel like this is really tight in the back of the leg. So if we want to reduce tightness and create more hip mobility, I have people stretch the hip flexors, high plank, because that lengthens everything, turns everything on, glute bridge, and then just to throw it in a little side plank. That creates more stability. That's a pretty standard warm-up. I've been using that for maybe 15 years, and it works. Especially if people seated all day. From that, you do a 5 to 7 minute warm-up, and you can get into a lot of other cool stuff. Now, the last thing I'm going to show here that a lot of people have questions on, and again, just take your time, study, and here's the other thing. Feel this. When you do exercise, feel what your hips are doing. Feel what your glutes are doing. When I was learning this stuff, you would have seen me in the gym with my hands all over my body because I want to feel what the muscles are doing. If I'm lengthening something, I'm watching what's happening. Watch your clients, watch how they move. Look at anatomy, watch how the clients move, and see. Once you start seeing the muscles, you can start coming up with a number of different exercises. So let's look at the SI joint. This is your sacrum. We have the cervical spine, that's 7 cervical vertebrae. We have the T-spine, the thoracic spine, and we have the lumbar spine, 7, 12, and 5 lumbar vertebrae. The way I've taught it for years is breakfast, 7, lunch, 12, lumbar is 5, dinner time is about 5 o'clock. So if you learn breakfast, lunch, and dinner, you know our 3 sections of the spine. Right here we have this. We have the sacrum. The sacrum that's where your coccyx down here. When people break their tailbone, they fall down, and this can fracture, which is not comfortable. I haven't had it, but I know people that have. So, but this, you don't have a lot of motion. Your SI joint, the sacrum, is the bottom of your pelvis. The SI joint is right here between the 2 halves. Your pelvis is actually 2 halves of a bone. There's actually 2 bones here that connect. So if this gets tight, there's not a lot of motion here at the SI joint, but if it gets tight, it restricts motion up above it. And the lumbar spine is not designed to be that mobile. The lumbar spine has more stability. The thoracic spine has more of the mobility. So if you sit up tall and rotate, that's your T-spine. If your SI joint, your SI stands for sacroiliac. If your SI joint gets tight, it can compress and make this area feel tighter. One of the best things to have people do is get on their hands and knees in a quadruped position and just rock back and forth. So if Captain Bones is on his hands and knees and he rocks back and forth, the knees are on the ground, the hands are on the ground, that's going to create a little bit of movement here in the SI. Again, the SI doesn't have a lot of motion, but what little movement it has is very important. If this gets tight, it's going to affect the motion all the way up the spine. And here's the other thing to know about the hip flexors. The reason why it's so important to get the hip flexors stretched before exercise, before really intense exercise, is if people try to extend their hip, if Captain Bones tries to extend his hip here and his glutes aren't really working that well, he can actually pull the lumbar spine forward a little bit because that psoas muscle attaches on the border of the spine. As that femur goes back into extension, it can pull on that, and that can cause some discomfort in the low back. That's why before people are really active, we want to stretch the hip flexors and we want to activate the glutes. By activating the glutes, we're contracting right here, which gets those muscles firing. That kind of resets what we call reestablishes link-tension relationship. If we do that, then what we're also doing is minimizing the stress here around the SI joint. But keep in mind, the SI joint is really important to warm up. If your clients have been seated all day, and most of them do, let's face it, or they're in a car for a while before they come to see you, we need to take the time, just get a little mobility in the SI joint. Here's another little thing, this is what I'm going to leave you with today. So if you want to mobilize through the shoulders, it's very easy. Keep your spine nice and tall. Just reach back behind you. This is a sagittal plane. I'm doing posterior reaches. This is a frontal plane. Notice I'm moving the shoulders and hips together. I want to keep a tall spine, move my shoulders and hips together. So if that's sagittal, that's frontal, where do you think I'm going to go next? Transverse. Rotate and rotate. Rotate and reach behind. Rotate and reach behind. If you do those 3 movements, you're going to create more motion up here at the T-spine and take away a lot of tightness. Now the same for the pelvis. If you have clients that spend a lot of time at their desk, or if you spend a lot of time sitting down, working on something, studying, then you want to stand up, hands right on your hips. What I'm going to do is rock side to side. Just nice and easy. Notice that I'm moving my pelvis. You keep doing that. What we're doing is creating a little pelvic-femoral rhythm. We're just going side to side. We're lubricating that hip joint. We're warming up those tissues. So side to side for about 30, maybe 40 seconds. Now hula hoop. Just nice big round circles. If we're doing nice big round circles, the femur is relatively fixed on the ground. That pelvis is moving over the femur. Now change direction. Go the other direction. Nice big round circles. You can already feel how that's warming up the low back a little bit, right? So we did side to side, nice big round circles in both directions. So what's the last plane of motion? Frontal, transverse, we got to go sagittal. So keep your hands on your pelvis, push forward. You're moving from the pelvis, not the spine. Push back. Push forward, push back. What you're doing is you're moving the pelvis over a relatively fixed femur. If you do that, if you teach that to the clients, 30 seconds in each direction, 30 seconds side to side, 30 seconds one way, 30 seconds the other, and 30 seconds forward and back in each plane of motion, that's less than 2 minutes. You take a little movement break. If you have them take a movement break at the desk, that can keep the hips nice and mobile throughout the day. Once an hour. That's why we have a lot of fitness trackers on. We can set that timer. The timer goes off. Have your clients get up and mobilize the pelvis. Or have them get up and mobilize the shoulder a little bit. And trust me, that way when they come in to see you, whether you're doing a lunchtime workout or an after work workout or later in the day workout, they won't be as tight, they won't be as restricted, and they can get in and get working a little bit quicker. So guys, I want to thank Marie and Dave for inviting me in. It's an honor to be here, honor to be working with ACE. And just take the time, if you understand your anatomy, everything else will fall into place.